Welcome to Passages Pulse, where we track the heartbeat of Israel and the Middle East from a Christian perspective. In a time of confusion, division, and misinformation, we're here to help you cut through the noise with truth, clarity, and conviction.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Passages Pulse. My name is Josiah McGee, here with my co-host, Olivia Layne. Today is Wednesday, April 2nd, 2026. We are here recording again in the midst of these strange negotiations happening regarding the Iran war. If you're curious about what's going on over there, we're not going to talk about it a lot today, but Cliff Notes version for you. It's been another busy week with not a lot actually being accomplished or happening, it seems like. A lot of deadlines, a lot of ultimatums, a lot of negotiations or talk about having negotiations. At the time we're recording, it seems like the big story, honestly, is whether or not Iran's leadership factions can get on the same page or not, about whether they're allowed to negotiate and what they're allowed to negotiate for. So really not a whole lot to talk about until those issues get sorted out. So this week our focus is going to shift a bit, and we're actually going to talk about something very different. There was an incident that happened in southern Lebanon over the weekend, or sometime shortly before that, really became a big story over the weekend. We've got a lot of questions about that. So that's what we're going to spend our time discussing today. And we're going to jump right into it because it's a juicy story. So, Olivia, if you wouldn't mind, I'd love it if maybe you could just kick us off and tell us a little bit about what do we know about the incident itself, and then we'll talk some about the various responses to it, including Israel's.
This happened over the weekend, and it absolutely took off. There was an image that sort of made its way around all of the various social media platforms. And the image, I'm sure we'll put it in the show notes or something, is that of an IDF soldier taking a sledgehammer to a large statue of Jesus. And this happened in southern Lebanon. And by Monday, the Israeli authorities concluded that it was an authentic image and that it was taken during IDF operations in southern Lebanon. And the picture was taken in a Christian village, the Christian village of Debil. I believe I'm pronouncing that right. And needless to say, the picture spread like wildfire and everybody has opinions on it. So I figured we should talk about it today. And I would love to hear from you, Josiah, a little bit more about how Israel has responded since the picture was released.
Yeah, of course. So thank you, Olivia, for giving that brief description. There's a lot more that could be said, but I think that's really the important details. And we'll get into some of the rest of it as this conversation flows, I'm sure. A bit about how Israel responded to this. I think that was something that I was very interested in because it became such a big story right away. And because, frankly, it was an incredibly obnoxious thing to do. So I was very curious to know, how is Israel going to respond to this? Because this is absolutely not okay. It was a pretty swift response, I would say. It was a combination, of course, of the obligatory statements from various high-level officials, both in the IDF, also in the government, the Prime Minister's office, for example, condemning the act and stating that this is against our values and this is against our rules and this is not okay. We're going to investigate. We're going to make sure that this act is punished. The investigation itself was pretty quick, I would say, as well. It didn't take long. I think as of yesterday, they'd already sort of wrapped up an initial investigation into the two individuals primarily responsible. There's more to come for the rest of the unit, it sounds like, but officially the response after the investigation was, this happened. It is, in fact, an illegal act. It violates the IDF's values, also its rules of operation and its procedures. It required some sort of punishment. Both the soldier who smashed the statue, or the face of the statue, and the one who took the photo, which I think is interesting and probably appropriate, were removed from duty and sentenced to 30 days of military detention. So, that's a pretty quick action taken to remove these individuals from the unit and sentence them to 30 days detention. The interesting sort of remaining part of the process is what happens to the other soldiers who were there. The rest of the unit who was in the vicinity, but it's unclear what role they played, if any actual role in these incidents. There are, I think, 6 additional bystanders who are basically, in my understanding, the way I'm reading these stories or these headlines coming out, is they're going to be called to more or less explain themselves, tell their side of the story, explain what were you doing when this happened? Could you have prevented it? Did you have an opportunity to speak up and did you, choose not to, or what was going on? Were you doing something else? Were you unaware at the time of what exactly was happening? And it sounds like if they're unable to explain and give an account for what they were doing when they were in the vicinity, but not directly involved, they may also face some sort of consequences, although I would imagine not as severe as those given to the two primarily responsible. So it's interesting. There's a lot there that we can unpack, but I think good to see that there's been a pretty quick response and there's more still to come.
Yeah, that's great. I think, as I was going through online, there's obviously so many people that are reacting so quickly to this. It's honestly one of the stories that I've seen take off the fastest and have the most reaction to, and in a decent amount of time, I feel like. And so as we were, talking about this episode and felt it was important to talk about it, we sort of compiled a list of some of the questions that people are beginning to ask online, some of the questions that I'm sure Passages alumni have too, because it's hard to tell what's real, what's manufactured, all those kinds of things. And so I guess the first question that I have for you, Josiah, is why is the IDF operating around these religious sites? And is that illegal for them to be operating around these religious sites in southern Lebanon?
Yeah, and that's a fantastic question. I certainly understand why people are asking questions like that. There are a couple layers to this. I think first some context as far as why the IDF is in the area in the first place, and then we'll maybe touch on is this illegal or not. So the IDF has been operating in southern Lebanon because that is a major stronghold for Hezbollah, both in terms of the number of Shiite communities there that support Hezbollah and the fact that it's close to Israel's border. I mean, Hezbollah has been building up its forces in that area for decades, really. And it's been a key part of the fight against Hezbollah since that began. Really more intensively, I would say in 2024 is when Israeli operations began to intensify against Hezbollah as part of the post-October 7 war. Now, it was doing so, Israel specifically, going into those areas because those areas are platforms where Hezbollah can launch rockets against Israel. It can also launch anti-tank missiles or things of that nature, which can be very, very dangerous to communities in Israel's north, especially those that are closest to the border, highly exposed and very vulnerable to those kinds of attacks. So that's why the IDF is operating in that area. Now, the problem in operating in those areas is that it's a combination of mountainous terrain in which Hezbollah can hide and civilian communities in which Hezbollah has been intentionally embedding itself. It's very common. If you've been listening to this podcast over the last year, you've probably heard us repeat this refrain several times that this is a pretty standard operating procedure for a terror organization, that they will protect themselves by embedding themselves and their equipment in civilian areas, including homes, schools, you name it. The communities of southern Lebanon are primarily Shia in many cases, but there are also a significant number of Christian villages in southern Lebanon. So it just so happens that as Israel is going into southern Lebanon and having to clear these areas of Hezbollah operatives and Hezbollah weapons, that they find themselves not just in Shia Muslim towns, but also in Christian towns and villages. The question of whether or not it's illegal for them to be there is, I think, an interesting one, but the answer is not so black and white, because under international law, essentially fighting around religious sites, or especially in a religious communities, a town or a village that is predominantly one religion or the other, is not necessarily forbidden. What is illegal and forbidden is a couple of things. One, operating there without some sort of justification. If you're primarily there because you're trying to kill a bunch of Christians, that's illegal. If you're primarily there without any particular reason other than it's a convenient place to stop, that's not really something that the IDF should be doing. If they're there because they have reason to believe that somewhere in that community there is a threat posed towards Israel, or that this community's location in some way represents a strategic opportunity for the IDF to advance the fight against Hezbollah, it's okay for the IDF to be there under international law. Now, the other thing that is not okay, however, that would constitute an illegal act, is if you're going to essentially enter without taking special care to preserve religious sites, heritage sites, religious artifacts, things of that nature. All that to say, the IDF operation itself in southern Lebanon is not illegal, and it is okay for the IDF to be in Christian villages without violating international law. However, the specific act of destroying a Christian statue or any other Christian religious artifact is absolutely illegal, which is why the IDF had to conduct this investigation and punish the perpetrators.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really important point of clarification that while the act of them being there might not be illegal, the act of them destroying that statue is absolutely illegal. And I think another question that I'm seeing online too is more of a broad generalization, but I'd love your thoughts on it anyways, because I think it is an important one, is does Israel hate Christians?
Yeah. Well, Olivia, actually, I think I have thoughts on this, but I would actually prefer maybe to pitch this question back to you first because you've spent a good amount of time living there over the past couple of years. I've been in Israel a lot, spent a lot of time there as a visitor, not necessarily as someone who spends a majority of the year living there. So be curious for your reactions maybe to that first before I offer my thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it is interesting. I was thinking about, this as all of this was unfolding over the weekend. And, I have spent a significant amount of time over the last 2.5 years living in Israel as a minority. Christians are a minority there, which is like an interesting thing to think about because, in the United States, especially where I'm from in the South, I make up the majority typically. But then when I'm in Israel, I'm not. I live as a minority. And as
Yeah.
somebody who has spent a significant portion of the last 2.5 years of my life living there, I have had countless people welcome me into their homes. I have had Jewish friends curiously ask me about my faith and share theirs with me. I have been hugged by random strangers on the street, and especially at times when I've gotten emotional at Christian heritage sites. And most recently, spent hours in a bomb shelter with a Jewish friend of mine who doesn't hold to the same beliefs that I do. And so I say all of that to say that I think the broad sweeping generalization that because of this one incident of a Israeli soldier harming a Christian statue means that all Israelis therefore must hate Christians is not just short-sighted, it's also a logical fallacy. And I think that it's important for us to recognize that there's a tendency to view isolated incidences in Israel as though they are representative of the entire Jewish society. And that's a double standard that I don't think we often implement with other groups, but for some reason in Israel, that is seemingly the rule that's often imposed onto them. And obviously, that's not to say, there are always going to be quote unquote bad apples. There are always going to be people in Israel who don't like Christians the same way that there are people in every society that don't like Christians, but they don't represent the entirety of Israeli society by any means.
Yeah, I think that's really that's really helpful context, Olivia, and I appreciate you sharing that. As you were going through those thoughts, one thing that stood out to me about what you had to say, if I could sort of reframe in my own words, is a lot of people struggle to understand what the difference between inappropriate criticism of Israel is and what is an anti-Semitic remark about Israel.
Hmm.
In my mind, the difference in many cases, and this is a great example of this, comes down to the ability to distinguish between the acts of an individual or individuals, plural in this case, and the character of an entire society. No, I don't think the entire society hates Christians. Unfortunately, there is a pretty clear case here where some individuals misbehaved very badly, but that doesn't mean that the entire society hates Christians. One of the things that definitely comes up too, I think, in a lot of conversations about this when people will ask me questions about this as well. At times, I think is hard for people to wrestle with how much gray there is in terms of how Israel relates to Christians, Christian members of its own society, even. In Israel, for example, how you relate to the rest of the society around you as a Christian is not just dependent on the fact that you are a Christian, but also depends significantly on the intersection of your Christian identity and your politics. So, for example, a Palestinian Christian living in Israel, not Gaza or the West Bank, but Israel proper, if you want to call it that, an individual who considers themselves, despite the fact that they live in Israel, to be a Palestinian and a Christian, they're going to have a very different relationship to the rest of Israeli society than someone who considers themselves to be an Israeli Christian, whether Arab or Aramaean, Maronite, whatever it may be, a person that considers themselves not to be a Palestinian, but an Israeli Christian who is fully integrated into Israeli society, in some cases even serving in the IDF or other national institutions, running for office. They have a very different conception of the role that they play in Israeli society. And Israeli society has a very different view of them, honestly, than they do Palestinian Christians, who they view as not wanting to be part of the nation or the national project that is the state of Israel. So it's complicated, I think, more so than people realize in a lot of cases. And there's a lot more color, I think, to this than is often given credit for. It's not so black and white as people might assume. Generally speaking, I think Israel's Christian minority is very well off. It's pretty well integrated. It's very highly educated. It's definitely safer, more free to worship than any other Christian minority in the Middle East. But the degree to which they feel like part of Israeli society, again, that really depends a lot on your politics and whether you want to be part of Israeli society and the state of Israel.
Hmm.
There's a couple of the things I thought that were interesting questions we got online about this issue. And I think really they came down to two things. One, how do Israeli Christians feel about this? And then how should American Christians feel about this? So maybe let's tackle the Israeli Christians first, and then we can sort of wrap this up with some thoughts about how American Christians should feel about what happened and the various consequences. On the question of Israeli Christians, I'll give a couple thoughts first, and then Olivia, if you want to tag in as well with any thoughts of your own. I mean, as I just alluded to, I think it's complicated. If your relationship to Israel was already complicated by this strange intersection of Palestinian politics with your Christian identity, then your view of what happened in Lebanon is going to be very complicated, and likely you're going to be very frustrated or angry about it. Relationship to Israel was already more positive because you viewed yourself as an Israeli citizen, someone who is fully committed to the national project that is the Jewish state of Israel. Then you're probably a little bit more understanding. I would say across the board, local Christians, based on what I've seen online from their reactions or in the couple people that I've sent a WhatsApp to and spoken with, of course they're frustrated. This was absolutely not okay. There's no excuse for it, and they're not going to make any excuses for it. Those who feel more fully integrated into Israeli society, I think, express more appreciation for the swift response of the IDF. Without that, I will say I think the frustrations would be significantly higher, even among those Christians who are more predisposed to be, more gracious or understanding about something like this. If the IDF had not punished the perpetrators, they would be, I think, more angry, more frustrated.
Mhm.
So it's important that the IDF did. There's also, I think, a sense in which some Christians share a relationship with Christians in Lebanon, for example. So this was something that really stood out to me as really quite interesting. There's a friend of ours, his name is Shadi Khalul. He's a Maronite Christian in Israel's north. Maronite belongs to this sort of not Arab, but technically it's Aramaean. It's a separate ethnic group that is predominantly Christian. And they're found not only in northern Israel, but also in Lebanon. Historically speaking, there's been a very large Maronite population in Lebanon. And his response basically was, again, I'm glad that they punished the perpetrators. Thank you, Israel/IDF, for doing that. But also, thank you to the IDF for being in Lebanon in the first place and protecting Lebanese Christians from Hezbollah. That's an angle that I think is maybe overlooked sometimes, that there are actually some Christians in Israel who, yes, of course, they're angry that this statue was broken, but they're also grateful for the fact that someone is protecting their brothers and sisters in Lebanon from a terror organization. I say all that to say, if you're trying to use Israel's Christians for your own agenda, it's probably not going to work very well because
Mhm.
they are all across the spectrum in terms of how they feel about this, how they react to it. And it has a lot to do with the fact that they have their own unique backgrounds in politics and priorities. And to try to stereotype Israel's Christians as having one reaction to this issue for your own agenda, again, probably a mistake, probably not going to work very well because they're not exactly monolithic on this issue or many other issues. Olivia, do you have any additional thoughts you want to react with?
Yeah, I think you put it perfectly. There's definitely a wide variety of reactions to be had because Israel holds so many different people with so many different opinions and different backgrounds. The Christians in Israel that I know, that I follow on social media, who have been reacting to this, which obviously, I don't know every Messianic in Israel. I don't know every Israeli Christian, but just the few that I know personally that have been, very public about their response to this have responded with really empathy and compassion to the soldier and the people who took the picture and were standing around, which is such an interesting response that it seems like American Christians are actually more outraged in some ways than a lot of what I'm seeing, than a lot of the Christians that actually live in Israel. And I think that speaks to what a different reality we have and what perception looks like, especially online. And yeah, I'd say that most of the time what I'm seeing is compassion. And I think that that's a very encouraging thing, actually.
I think that's unfortunately not that surprising. I mean, if you look at, to get philosophical for a second, set aside the politics of the Middle East and politics of Christians in the Middle East and all of that. The way that social media shapes our human interactions on a daily basis is profound and deeply tragic.
Hmm.
The lack of any real sincere empathy or
Hmm.
compassion for other people, the ways that social media conditions us to be harsh and to say things about people or even to people that you would never say to them in person. I mean, that it's weird. It's like social media basically removes our ability to filter human interactions in a polite way and to feel genuine human connection. I think it makes sense. I mean, it honestly just makes all the sense in the world that someone who actually lives in Israel and interacts with different types of people, Christians of different backgrounds, Jewish people of different backgrounds, Muslims on a daily basis, that they would actually be more compassionate and understanding
Yeah.
because they don't experience all of these different stories or realities through this weird lens of social media. I mean, that's really unfortunate, but honestly, it kind of makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, it does. And it also, I think, I think in a way it can be convicting too to see. And it can be easier, I think, to forgive people that that you're close to and that you live with every day. But I think that for me, I thought to myself, and I would love to hear your thoughts on this too when it comes to like, how should Christians respond to seeing things like this? Obviously, first and foremost, we have to recognize that we're seeing it through the lens of social media, which obviously involves a lot of outrage in general. And I think one of the things to keep in mind is that, people keep asking me, like, do you think it's wrong that the IDF did this? Of course, I think it's wrong that the IDF did this. And I'm thankful that the IDF also admitted themselves that it was wrong that they did this and that they're willing to hold the soldiers and the people who were there accountable and to recognize as Christians that the wrong actions of a few don't characterize the attitude of many of the entire society of Israel. And I think that, like many of the Israeli Christians that I'm seeing online, we should also be willing to lead with this sort of mercy and compassion. And, the first thing I thought of when I saw that statue lying on the ground was Christ on the cross. And Christ on the cross said, "Forgive them, Father, they don't know what they're doing." And I think we need to be leading with compassion here. The man that tore down that statue doesn't know Christ. And that should compel us to respond with compassion and mercy rather than just this like sheer rage that I'm really seeing online. That's really the main thing that comes to my mind is just the absolute level of rage that I'm seeing from Christians on the internet. And it was wrong. And I think that there is, righteous anger is absolutely one thing, but holding on to that anger in a way that's like letting it consume you and letting it consume the way that you see an entire people group is absolutely not what Christ modeled, and it does not in any way lead to truth, healing, or any type of productive change.
Yep. I mean, all of that. Yes, I would agree, Olivia. That's really good. I think especially the reminder to be compassionate and see this person not as just the perpetrator of something that was wrong, but as a person who is in need of the same mercy and compassion that Christians believe we are
Yeah.
the recipients of. I think that's a really important reminder about what it actually looks like to model the type of outreach to the world that Jesus did, to
Mhm.
model the kind of relationship that he wanted to have with other people, including those people who disagreed with him or even opposed him very actively.
Mhm.
I think, I mean, a few thoughts of my own on how American Christians can respond to something like this. One of the things that definitely seems to be coming up, and this is a pretty repetitive theme when someone in Israel does something wrong, immediately there's this debate between two opposing sides within American churches. And on one side, you've got all the people who say, this is just proof that Israel is bad. Israel is terrible. Christians should not support it. They are opposed to Christianity. In some cases, anti Semitic remarks like they killed Jesus. What do you expect?
Mhm.
These are the Christ killers, the sons of Satan. Why should we be supporting these people? Then you have the people on the other side of the spectrum who argue Israel can do no wrong because they are God's chosen people. You can't criticize them because they're perfect. God's chosen people have to be perfect. Obviously, both of those positions are flawed. There are two
Mhm.
extremes that do not represent reality, nor I would argue are they theologically, scripturally faithful interpretations of what Christians actually believe or are supposed to believe, anyways, in my opinion. And that means that Christians really have to find a way to, American Christians especially, we're not very good at this. We have to find a way to wrestle with a reality that is more complicated. You don't have to, in order to consider yourself a Christian Zionist, you don't have to believe that Israel can do no wrong or that it is absolutely perfect. Calling yourself a Christian Zionist means that you call yourself a Christian and you also believe that Israel has a right to exist. That's really all that that means. That's what that label or that term means. At the same time, that doesn't mean that you should overgeneralize when someone in Israel screws up and say, okay, the entire society is bad or broken or something is wrong with it, sick about Israel. That those two extremes should not exist. Now, what I find very interesting and something that I wish we could see more of, if you look at many Jewish Zionists or supporters of Israel, many of them are absolutely committed to the principle that Israel has a right to exist and they support Israel, they love Israel. At the same time, they can also be very critical of Israel and have strong opinions about the actions of different parts of Israeli society or the Israeli government or the composition of Israel's government, or whatever it may be. And the reason why, I think, is because they really love Israel. They
Mhm.
want to see it flourish and thrive. And so they view a constructive criticism of Israel as an act of love towards Israeli society. And I honestly wish we could see more of that from Christians. It's
Mhm.
okay to be absolutely committed, and I hope you are committed to Israel's right to exist and to love the people of Israel, and simultaneously believe that an act of love is sometimes to say something when you need to say something. Like that's not okay.
Mhm.
If you love Israel and want to see it flourish, really, I think that that love for Israel and motivation will shape how you criticize Israel when something like this happens. I think it's fair that people expected a response from Israel because this was wrong. And it's okay to say
Mhm.
that. And honestly, if you love Israel as a Christian, you probably should be saying that. At the same time, I also think that once Israel did respond, Israel should be applauded and encouraged for doing the right thing and punishing the soldiers. Positive reinforcement is also helpful and saying, yes, thank you for doing the right thing in this instance, because their actions do not reflect the Israeli society that you and I know. And it's important to not just call out the bad, but also to applaud and affirm the good when we see it. The last thing that I'll say, I don't really know the details regarding the other soldiers' involvement. And to your point, Olivia, I think it's important that we be praying for all of them as well, because they are unfortunately caught up in a massive storm that may or may not have been due to their involvement. I don't know if they had anything to do
Yeah.
with it. It's really unclear at this point. It's possible that this was totally not their fault and they are just in the wrong place at the wrong time,
Yeah.
dealing with the consequences of someone else. But that being said, if it does come out that they could have prevented the incident and did nothing, I hope that they too are also held to a higher standard, because it's important that we collectively, hold each other to a very high standard, that the IDF is holding its members to a high standard, that Christians are holding Christians to a high standard. And honestly, if we consider ourselves friends, Christians and Jews can also collectively hold each other to a high standard of respect and honor for one another. Those are my thoughts. Most of that is opinion. And I think it's important to maybe give that disclaimer before we wrap this up. Olivia, do you have any final thoughts before we close?
Huh, I think you put it perfectly, and I think that, the last thing I'd say is that, as I was watching people respond online to this, one of the things that I thought of is that I actually know multiple Israeli Christians who actually serve in Lebanon protecting these Christian communities and who are in the IDF. No, it just is such a disgrace and such a sad thing to me that that isn't highlighted as well, that there are Christians who love the IDF and who volunteer so that they can, as Christians, as Israeli Christians, who serve their country. But I think you said it perfectly that, it's fair to expect a response from Israel, and I'm glad that they did. And positive reinforcement is important, and it is important to recognize that they did the right thing here. They made the right move. And if they hadn't, people would absolutely have a right to continue to be outraged by this. But I hope as Christians we'll learn to be more compassionate and empathetic and keep these people in our prayers.
All right. I think that about wraps this up. I think we've talked about this enough for one day, Olivia, but thank you for hopping on and sharing a few thoughts, listening to me rant as well for a few minutes. Appreciate that. We appreciate everyone else for tuning in and listening this week. Thank you also to our producer, Lindsay, for helping us to publish this episode. We hope you'll come back next week. We'll actually have, I think, a very interesting follow up to this conversation, because we have a special guest coming who's recently written a piece about persecution of Christians and how we think about this in terms of American foreign policy. Across the Middle East, obviously, there is very real persecution of Christians happening. So we'll be having, I think, a very fascinating conversation about that next week. I hope that you will tune in and join us again. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Passages Pulse. Passages seeks to prepare and empower a new generation of Christian leaders who love God, stand with the Jewish people, and support Israel. To learn more about Passages, follow us on social media or visit www.passagesisrael.org. Until next time, we'll keep you connected to the Pulse.